think we have everyone. So welcome to the weekly webinar for May 19th. Today is a very special webinar. We will be discussing Strong Start and discuss also the community grants and provide a lot more information on where to go there as well. So today we have many of our team with us. I believe we have Lizzie Kosey as well as Lindsay Bradford, Meredith Eckerd, Taylor Dunn, Devin as well. She's new on our team, and probably a few more people as well from our team. So we're glad to have everyone here. Okay. Taylor, did you want to start, or are you on yet?
Yep, I am, but you have some reminders, right, first?
Yes, of course. So just to get us started then, we're going to review the Strong Start 2020 guidance and provide an opportunity for everyone to answer some questions you might have about the community level COVID-19 recovery grants. This would be a great opportunity to have those questions ready. We'll also go over some reminders, go through the Strong Start guidance, talk about those grants, and talk about some data to support the COVID-19 recovery process. So right now, everyone is working on their lead agency RFA timeline. I'm sorry, RFA. And it was released on the 23rd. And everyone has already sent in their intent. And this Friday is May 22nd. The application will be due this Friday by 4:30. And I'd just like you to know that if you have any questions or concerns about submitting for this Friday, please email me or give me a call. That's my number. Please call me, text me, or email me, and I'm happy to work with you. We can discuss any questions or concerns that you have. So Leela is still taking nominations, and if you have a potential participant for Leela, it would be a director of a type 3 center. They should be, the center should be proficient and above. Please nominate them. There is an application. They would complete a video with, go through some promotional webinars. This is a really great opportunity. It's a 2-year opportunity for the Early Leaders Academy, and Emmy O'Dwyer is leading this work. So if you have a type 3 center director that has done some outstanding work, and just, this is a great opportunity to nominate them for this particular fellowship. So.
Hey, Amanda, this is Lizzie. I'm just going to jump in real quick. I don't think it's a 2-year program. I think it's just the second year that they're doing it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So no, it's okay. It's a 1-year program, I think.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Did I miss? Oh, the budget updates. Lizzie, can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yes, of course. It's Lizzie again, just jumping in with my weekly budget updates. Thank you to all of you who have heard it a million times. I'm sorry for having to repeat myself so many times. The first one is lead agency budget related. Unfortunately, we thought there might be some flexibility when it came to your CCDF dollars, but we found that at this time they cannot be rolled over. So we recommend that you revisit that budget and you possibly rearrange some line items. This slide needs to be updated. Rearrange some line items. I mean, we originally thought state funds would need to be spent first, but if there's anything that you want to get spent before the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th, just know that unfortunately those CCDF dollars don't look like they're going to be able to roll over.
Is that it?
you must submit those reimbursements by June 1st. So that applies to those who received infant class money, or if you are in cohort 2 of Ready Start Networks. So if this is a concern, please send me an email. And I will say, for those of you whom this does affect, you will be hearing from me and probably from Devin. She's going to lean in a little bit there to help me get in touch with you just to see where you are in terms of spending your money. And we'll try and do whatever we can to make sure those dollars can get spent. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lizzie. All right, I want to take a pause right here. If you have any questions at this point, but we're going to toss it to Taylor, and she's going to talk to us about Strong Start.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Lead Agency Weekly webinar. For those of you who attended Jessica's webinar last Thursday on Strong Start, some of this is going to be repetitive. However, we are going to spend a little bit more time today discussing the details of the community level grant that was released and giving you an opportunity to ask questions or raise any concerns that you may have. So we will review some of the overview of Strong Start, and then I'll pass it over to Lizzie to get into the details of this grant application. So Amanda, you can go on to the next slide. Perfect. So we worked in partnership with some early childhood advocacy organizations and many of you all over the course of our weekly webinars and our Ready Start Network community of practices and through calls to try to develop a framework that articulates the most important priorities for moving forward beyond COVID-19. And the four big buckets, the four big most important priorities that we've articulated are these four. So first, we hope that all childcare centers have the tools and resources that they need to reopen safely and in accordance with the Office of Public Health guidelines. So of course, the tools and resources might look different for every center. For some centers, this might be financial support. For others, it might be supplies and PPE. For others, it might be support around staffing and recruiting families to return. But we really want to set up childcare centers to be successful and reopen safely. Second, and it's heavily related to the first, but we really hope that communities can sustain or increase access to early childhood for families in both the near and long term. We know that it's going to be challenging and that much of the work we've done collectively to increase access feels particularly at risk right now, given how many providers have closed temporarily and how much restructuring has happened. So this is a big priority, and we hope that you kind of work with us to think about what are the strategies to sustain or increase access in the wake of COVID-19. The next one is that teachers are prepared to lead classrooms and provide high quality interactions for children every day. So we know that as we adjust back to normal, whatever that looks like, staffing may have changed, the challenges that teachers are facing may look different, the classroom configurations may look different. We want to do everything we can to assure that teachers are prepared and that classrooms are still high quality for children.
Hey, it looks like Amanda must have lost her connection. So I can, if you give me just a moment, I can pull up the PowerPoint where she left off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lizzie.
You're welcome.
I think I'm back on. Oh, I don't know what happened.
It's okay. I think Lizzie is pulling it up.
Oh, good.
Just bear with us for one moment. Sorry about this, y'all. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Lizzie. Okay. So last Thursday, right around the time that we hosted the webinar, we released this early childhood strong start planning guide. And I just want to reemphasize that we as a state and all of you all on the call have made considerable progress in both unifying and strengthening the early childhood system, both at the state level and at the individual community levels. And we want to make sure that we all collectively go into the next few months and the next academic year strong so that we don't lose this ground that we've covered already. So the Strong Start Planning Guide provides priorities that you all and sites should consider when preparing and planning for the summer and fall. And we really want to empower you all as the coordinators and leaders of your early childhood community networks to take on a role of leadership in this work, which may require that you work across community organizations in partnership with your child care resource and referral agency, and partner with other entities and partner with school systems, et cetera, to ensure that there is a community-wide plan in place for reopening early childhood programs. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that will look like. So this is what the planning guide looks like. If you have not already accessed it, I recommend that you do so. I'm going to quickly copy and paste this link into the chat box so that you can pull it up if you haven't already accessed it. And this, the guide has planning priorities. These are not requirements, but they are priorities for you to think about as you as a community begin planning for the recovery of the childcare sector and the early childhood work in your community. But we also in this document have announced 3 funding sources, potential funding opportunities that we want to make sure you guys are really clear on, that you're fluent in, that you understand the difference between these different opportunities. So first, and what we'll spend the most time talking about today, is what we're calling the COVID-19 Community Child Care Recovery Grants. Those are grants that you all as lead agencies will apply for. The second is a second round of what we're calling LaCAP relief grants, which is the Louisiana Child Care Assistance Provider Relief Grants. So these are provider level grants that individual child care center providers or family child care providers or in-home providers can apply for directly. And then last is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, which is really designed for school systems, and this funding is flowing through primarily to school systems in a formula funding manner. And then a portion of it is competitive, but it's important to note that this funding source can be used for pre-K. So if you have not already done so, you should consider having conversations with your school system to make sure that pre-K is prioritized as decisions are made around this funding source. All right, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'll give a high overview of the community level grant. And I believe Lizzie just dropped the RFA for this grant into the chat box. So if you haven't already taken a look at it, you certainly should. We sent it out by email last week in a Word document format, but if we need to resend that, we would be happy to. So we're inviting you all as lead agencies to complete an application for funding to support the recovery of childcare in your communities. And we're not going to be overly prescriptive about what activities you propose to fund to support childcare, but at a minimum, we hope that you include or think about some of these. So first, we've heard from a lot of different folks that it would be helpful to provide workforce incentive bonuses for teachers and staff returning to work in childcare after a period of unemployment. So you may partner with childcare centers in your communities and determine a process for paying returning workers a small bonus or a bonus. And that might look different for different centers. Maybe you find that there's a particular region of your parish or community where they're having a really hard time getting people to come back to work for whatever reason. You might decide to target some of that funding there. Additionally, you might decide to award subgrants to childcare providers. So we as a state are issuing these LaCAP provider grants, but you may decide that that's not enough. And to keep these folks in business, they might need a bit more of a stimulus. You could apply for funding to do that. You could also apply for funding to purchase additional PPE or any sort of cleaning supplies that childcare centers may need as they run out of this initial supply that has been provided or is being provided. Or you might consider other community level supports focused on recovery that supports childcare centers. Maybe something on some sort of re-enrollment event, focused on supporting families to re-enroll, or something that supports classroom quality after COVID-19. Again, we don't want to be overly prescriptive, but we think at a minimum, these bullets are things that you should think about doing in your community. So this should have been past tense. We already emailed a Word document of this application, and we're asking that the intent to apply be completed by May 21st. We know this is a really tight timeline. We just want you to send in an email that says, I intend to apply on behalf of my community. And then we're asking that you indicate a proposed funding amount in that email. That could change, and that's fine. We just want you to give us a sense of where you're headed. And then final applications will be due on June 12th. And very quickly, we will turn around these applications and make notifications of the award the week of June 15th. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the LaCAP relief grants, and these are the direct grants to centers that centers, or I should say providers, can apply for directly. And I want to make clear how these are different than the community level grants, because we've already had some questions about communities applying for the LaCAP relief grants. These are grants that providers can and should apply for directly themselves. So there is no responsibility put on you all right now to do anything in order for providers to apply for these grants. However, we do encourage that you all understand these grants, be able to answer questions about these grants if you get them from providers, and generally offer your support as it's needed or helpful to providers who are considering applying for these grants. I see that Lizzie just dropped in the chat box that applications for the community level grant are due June 12th. We will follow up with some information again about the community level grants. So if you have questions about that, we'll be able to address them. But before we move on, I do just want to name that there will be 2 rounds of this LaCAP relief grant. So we've actually, there will be a total of 3 and potentially more. We've already issued 1 round that went out early May. The second one will go out early June, and providers will be eligible if they are either type 3 or as certified home-based providers operational by June 1st. And they will be awarded a dollar amount of $187.50 per child in licensed capacity. And then once those applications are submitted, the grant funds are expected to be turned around very quickly by the 2nd week in June. Then, because we know that not all providers will be operational by June 1st, we are signaling to the field that another round of relief grants for childcare providers will come later in summer, because we want to both support providers as they come back online and become operational in early June, but we don't want to over-incentivize providers who may not be ready to open. And so we want to ensure that there's more funding opportunities on the horizon for providers who remain closed during phase 1. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. And the last thing I will say about funding is just to reiterate that the school system funding that is flowing through to school systems can and should be used to support pre-K. So we've actually changed the Strong Start framework that used to say K to 12. Now it says pre-K to 12. We want to make it perfectly clear to superintendents and other school system leadership that that funding can and should be used to support pre-K. And you can do that in a number of ways. So you could actually make a decision to use some of the funding to actually fund additional pre-K seats. So you might find that there's an increased demand and increased need for pre-K seats in your community because of financial hardships experienced during COVID-19. You can actually use some of this funding, the school system funding, to cover the cost of pre-K seats if you so choose. You could also purchase materials or adaptations to ensure that continuous learning happens for pre-K classrooms. You could provide PD for staff, kind of regardless of facility closures. So you could choose to provide PD for pre-K teachers. And then you can also, just in the same way that school systems are currently making plans for devices and internet connectivity for families, that can also include pre-K students as well. All right, so now before I turn it over to Lizzie, who's going to talk more about the details of the Community Grants RFA, I do just want to kind of walk through at a high level what's included in the Strong Start framework. So as I mentioned, really the categories fall into these four, or the priorities fall into these four categories: that childcare centers can safely reopen, that communities can sustain or increase access, that children continue to have high quality experiences, and that families are supported through all of this. And the framework has these categories, and then within the categories, it has priorities, information about funding, and then resources. So here's a screenshot of what the first category in the framework looks like. This is health, safety, and operations. There are only two priorities here. Really, this emphasizes that communities and sites need to be thinking about how to ensure that centers can reopen with the public health guidelines in place. We emphasize that centers are eligible for the LaCAP relief grants to support reopening, and that communities can apply for grants to support centers reopening. We also want to emphasize in the second priority that not only are centers, do they have the basic requirements in place, but that they're adequately training returning staff so that staff deeply understand the public health guidelines and can ensure the health and safety of kids in their care. So the next category is sustaining and expanding access. There's four priorities here. I won't walk through all of them, but really this is aligned to the goals of supporting childcare to either reopen or stay open. We know that right now childcare providers across the state are facing, in some cases, insurmountable financial challenges related to having to close their doors for a period of time, or even when they reopen, there's the additional costs of the reduced group sizes and costs of covering cleaning supplies, etc. So really we want to equip you all to support centers and to be leaders in this space. So you'll see some priorities designed to do that. The next one is classroom quality and continuous learning. In many ways, this will look fairly similar to some of the pre-K to 12 framework if you've reviewed that at all. This is just emphasizing that children's social and emotional development needs to be prioritized, and that communities and sites should be thinking about continuous learning in the case of school closures or center closures in the future. And then you can see there's a host of resources that we've linked here. We hope this is helpful. Please, review these and and understand what's available to you, and let us know if you have any questions. And then last, the final category is around family engagement and support. We really want you all to be thinking about how, if at all, will you support families, and how will you ensure that re-enrollment happens safely with families' needs in mind. So you will see some priorities aligned to that, and then resources aligned to each of those priorities. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lizzie, who's going to walk you through some details of the Community Grants RFA.
Yes, thanks, Taylor. Real quick, I see Lydia unmuted herself. Lydia, do you have a question?
No, ma'am. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just thought you might want to say something. Just checking. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk specifically about the COVID-19 Community Child Care Recovery Grants that you as lead agencies are eligible to apply for in order to specifically support childcare in your communities. So here's our basic timeline, and we recognize that the timeline has a pretty quick turnaround, but I want to emphasize that what you need to email by the end of this week, we recognize that it's subject to change. So, you know, we released this information last week. We should have sent a Word document to all lead agency contacts. I'm looking at the chat box, and it looks like a couple of people are missing that. So, Manny Lee, we will hopefully get another copy to you ASAP. In 2 days, we want you to submit an intent to apply email to our new teammate, Devin Camerata, with an estimated total funding request. Now, again, we recognize, you know, if you submit that request and you realize it's not high enough, or it's actually too high and you don't need that much, it's okay if that funding amount changes before June 12th. But we just want a general estimated total so that we can start planning and figuring out how much we will be giving out in allocations for these grants. I will also say that in the RFA itself, we have a chart there that lists your size and lists kind of like a high and a low range for what you can apply for. So please feel free to use that as a guide as you determine what that final total amount might be. And again, you will submit your final application to Devin by June 12th. And the week of June 15th, we will notify the recipients of the grant. So a very quick turnaround. We want to get this money to support childcare as fast as we can. So we're thankful for your hard work in advance for helping us figure out how we can do that. So in order to complete this application, this is like a general overview slide of what the application looks like. And in order to complete it, you'll first need to kind of assess the impacts of COVID-19, specifically on early childhood in your community. We ask some probing questions, how many centers closed, things like that. But I will say, we are hopefully going to provide for you very soon some COVID-19 specific data kits that we're going to talk about a little later in this presentation. And hopefully that data will help you assess the impacts in your community and be able to answer those questions more easily. We also want you guys to kind of come up with top 3 priorities of what your focus is right now in the early childhood recovery efforts, and to share those with us. We're interested to hear how you are going to address those strong start planning categories, looking at each of those 4 big buckets and what you hope to do in your community to ensure that they're true. You will request funding to support the childcare sector in a certain section that aligns with the strong start planning priorities. And we hope that you can engage with program partners and get a little feedback before you submit your final version to us. Again, we realize this is a tight turnaround, but The good news is that a lot of you are already using online platforms for meetings and engaging your partners virtually. So we'd like you to continue to do so for this application. So the very first section, this is what I was alluding to earlier. The very first section is we're going to ask some probing questions that will help you assess just how big COVID-19, how much it impacted your community in the early childhood sector. So, for example, of the type 3 centers or home-based providers that existed before COVID-19, how many plan to reopen and on what timeline? It's important to know how many did have to close temporarily. What are the greatest barriers to successfully reopening for childcare providers in your community? A lot of them, it might be staff and workforce returning. Some of them, it might be the lower ratios or the increased need for cleaning supplies and PPE. The third question is, are there particular areas of your community where you're concerned that families who need childcare will not be able to access childcare? What are the greatest challenges facing the early childhood workforce in your community? And finally, are the challenges for childcare providers and workforce universally experienced in your community, or are there particular providers that may need more targeted support? So we just want you to consider these questions as you are determining what your community most needs and how you can spend these dollars, and get the more bang for your buck, so to speak. Who really needs the most help and how can you do that? And it's important to look at numbers and to look at data to help you get there. So after you assess the early childhood in your community and share what you've learned in your applications, we ask that you identify 3 priorities to aid in early childhood recovery efforts. So I'm going to pause here because I'm very interested to hear from you, because I'm assuming that many of you have already been thinking about what are these big priorities and how can you help. So I'd love to hear what you think some of your major priorities will be. You can unmute yourself or type in the chat box. So Bridget from Sabine lists that safety is one of her major priorities, and I think that's a great idea. And I think that's on the minds of a lot of people and a lot of parents who are deciding whether or not to send their child back. Looks like Carmen said 1, health and safety, 2, quality, and 3, access. Lee says PPE. Stacy said several of our centers have concern about losing many staff members and not returning to work. Yeah, that sounds familiar. Arita from Webster also said PPE. Yeah, those are all concerns that have definitely come across our desks at the department, and so it seems like there's a lot of universal concerns across the state, and that is of safety, that is of workforce returning, and making sure quality and access are still moving forward. Let's see. Daycare centers are struggling with staff returning, safety as well. Okay. And Carmen asked, can you give guidance on staff incentives? Is there a general amount? I don't think we're going to be overly prescriptive there in terms of how much you would want to give those workforce returning incentives. Open to hearing from other networks and hearing how they could come up with those numbers, but that's really up to you. It might be something you might want to discuss with some of your directors and see what makes the most sense with to them. Manny says PPE and staying in business. Yes, we want to make sure our child care centers stay in business. Lee says overall opening plan, employees returning, in St. Mary. Yeah, so thank you all so much for sharing all of your priorities. This has been really interesting.
Lizzie,
yeah.
Can I jump in real quick? I just want to say, I see some of you saying that you didn't receive the email with the Word version of this RFA. We sent it from lead agency support on Friday at around 3 p.m. And I'm seeing some of you on the BCC list, those of you who said you didn't receive it. So it may have gone to spam, and it may be because it came from lead agency support as opposed to one of our email addresses. So you may try searching lead agency support in your inbox to see if it comes up. Either way, we will send it again so that you have it at the top of your inbox. But just wanted to say, if you may be able to find it in your inbox right now if you're interested in searching for lead agency support. Back to you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Taylor. All right, I'm going to move on. Thanks to everyone for sharing some of your priorities. Michelle said, can incentives be given to workers who worked in centers that remained open? Taylor, I'm going to defer to you on this.
I think so, Michelle. I don't think the answer is no, at least. I would just think about what makes the most sense. Obviously, you don't want to penalize the folks who have been working and only reward the people who are coming back to work. So if it makes the most sense in Calcasieu to kind of give incentives to workers across the board, both those who have been working and those who are returning, I think we would certainly be amenable to that.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. All right, and Taylor previously hit on all 4 of these buckets, but in the second section of this grant application, we kind of rehash out those 4 major buckets of how we want, of the priorities that we outlined in the Strong Start framework, including making sure child care centers have the tools and resources they need to open safely and in accordance with Office of Public Health guidelines. And it seems to me that a lot of you, that is your main priority, is the safety component. Secondly, we want to make sure communities sustain or increase access. Thirdly, teachers are prepared to lead classrooms and provide high quality interactions for children every day. And fourthly, families are supported to re-enroll children in early childhood programs or to provide quality care and education in their homes if programs are unable to reopen or remain open. So in the second section of the RFA, we asked the question, how do you plan to address those 3 priorities you previously listed? So when you're thinking about health, safety, and operations, when you're thinking about access and those other 2 categories, what are some ways you can address those priorities to fulfill your, reaching of those goals? Just thinking about, the safety component, thinking about, workforce incentive component. Please feel free to share in the chat box if you are thinking of anything maybe that hasn't been mentioned yet, or any creative solution that your network is coming up with. That would be great. Also, I wanted you to keep in mind, someone reached out and was wondering if this grant could support curriculum purchases, and that would obviously fall under classroom quality bucket. Well, there is still a curriculum initiative in place, and it's still an available resource for you. And when you apply for the curriculum initiative, Type 3 centers can be reimbursed at 80%. So it's possible that in the RFA, if you would like to, you could cover the difference of 20%. I see a lot of questions in the chat box, and I see Taylor's answering them. I will voice over, though, that yes, this grant is specifically for supporting childcare. It is going to be funded by CCDF, which is Child Care Development Fund. So this is not money that can cover pre-K costs. We encourage you to reach out to your superintendents. If there are things pre-K related that you would like to fund, that would come through the pre-K through 12 Strong Start.
And similarly, Lizzie, Head Start, it's not intended that this community grant support Head Start, because Head Start has its own federal funding source and is in a very different situation than childcare during the closures. However, if there are particular situations, like for example, if there's a early Head Start childcare partnership and it's a CCAP provider who also enrolls Head Start children, they may be eligible for these funds. So let us know the situation, and it may be that some of your Head Start providers are eligible, but generally speaking, this is intended for childcare centers who enroll kids through CCAP.
Thanks for clarifying, Taylor. Again, there's a third section, requests for fund. This is where you will actually put the total amount that you'd like to request. And these are some of the activities we previously mentioned, but we list them here for, these are some of the ways you can support childcare at this time, and we ask you to consider when you're applying for money for this grant. So directly supporting childcare might look like workforce incentive grants, like we previously mentioned, or sub-grants to childcare centers, or even the purchase of additional PPE and supplies. You could also apply for other community level supports, including workforce training. Of course, that might look a little differently than it would before. It might be remote training. And lastly, family engagement and coordinated enrollment, if you might need some additional funds to tap into either of those buckets, this would be the place to do it, to apply for it. So we've kind of talked about this already. We have hit on how some of you are planning to use these funds to support the childcare sector. So the first question we've kind of talked about already, but the second question, which is if you provide sub-grants for your childcare partners, do you plan on having them complete an application or a set of assurances, and how do you envision engaging with them? I do want to pause and talk about this because this is something that has been put on our radar, and I wanted to hear from you directly some of your ideas for getting, you know, understanding what your childcare partners need, and also, you know, managing this money. Do you want them to sign a set of assurances? Do you want them to fill out an application?
I see a couple questions in the chat box. Lizzie, can I jump in?
Of course.
Barbara, I see you have a question. If the network has a type 1 center that has become a type 3 center in the past month, if they receive funding with the COVID grant, how long do they have to stay a type 3 center? For both grants, both the LaCAP relief grant as well as the community grant, we're saying that a newly converted type 3 center, a type 3 center that has recently changed from type 1 or type 2, needs to commit to being a type 3 center at least through the end of 2020 in order to justify them receiving these funds. And then I see Molly Blanchard asks, what's the timeline for funds to be spent distributed once they're awarded? So we hope that these funds get to you very quickly in the community level grant, I will say very quickly in June, and that you can start spending in early July. I believe the timeline for this funding is a full year. It'll be the next fiscal year funding, and I think it will be available for you in EGMS for a full year. But we anticipate that most people will probably spend it in the first few months, since the greatest needs are really around reopening. So again, there's flexibility, and if there are particular things that you want to fund that stretch for the full academic year, that can be possible. But we anticipate that most people will spend these community level grants in the first few months.
I also see that Mary Graham Howard asked, will there be supplies for ECE through R&Rs, or will there still be supplies? Yes, I believe everyone should have probably heard from their R&R regarding the PPE supplies that they're providing. I think those are a 1 month supply, if I remember correctly. And so if you apply for this grant and you think that you want to, purchase some additional supplies, that would be in addition to what you are receiving with the R&Rs. Maybe you want to get another month or whatever you think is best for your community, you can do so here.
Hey, Lizzie, this is Amanda. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the question if you provide sub-grants for your child care partners, do you plan on having them complete an application or a set of assurances? And how do you envision engaging with them? I just want to ask on behalf of a lead agency, would it be a good practice or a best practice to have an application and a set of assurances for these sub-grants for the child care partners?
Well, that's what we're asking them. We kind of wanted to hear from them because it did come across our radar that someone asked, is this something we should do? And again, the department for this, I don't think we want to be overly prescriptive.
Right.
And it depends on the size of the network. So for example, if you have 100 childcare centers, that application is going to look different than if you have 5. So I guess it just depends on the network and what their needs are. I did want to hear from some to hear, do they intend on having these, having their type 3 centers apply, or exactly how they were going to go about doing it. I haven't heard from anyone yet, which is okay. And I understand a lot of people might still be working those out right now. But do see.
It's a good question. It's kind of a heavy question to kind of think about right now, but it's a really great question for them to think about and plan for.
Manny, you have something you want to share? I see you unmuted.
Well, I'm in a. Hold on, I got 2 computers going on.
You got an echo.
Yeah, I got 2 systems going on because one wasn't working. Hold on, okay?
Okay.
Let me turn this one off.
Oh, I think it's better now.
Yeah. But anyways, I do agree that you have to have a lease applications and assurances, but it depends on the amount that you have. You may also want to have some sort of a contract or agreement with them, with what is expected for them to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking, that's a great point, Manny, and I'm looking in the chat box and it looks like Stacy of Livingston, she has experience awarding sub-grants earlier this year, and they did do an application and a set of assurances, and they're thinking of doing the same with this. Stacy, that's great. It looks like you've shared your email address, and some people might be reaching out to you to get that info there. And also Cindy Rushing of Rapide said they're conducting a survey to gauge need through SurveyMonkey, and they hope to do a simple application. I think that sounds like a great idea, Cindy. Also, there are lots of questions today, just trying to keep up. Real quick, Lee did ask from EBR, any advice on how to get newly converted sites to commit to remaining type 3 after they receive the funds? I think that's a great question, and one that I just want to bring to the whole team, the whole group here, and see if anybody has any ideas there.
And Lizzie, this is Taylor. I know that the ops team at the department has some plans in place to hold sites to convert to type 3 to this agreement for the LaCAP grants. So we may be able to provide some information about what we're doing at the department level. It could look very different than what you choose to do at the network level, but that may be helpful. So we can certainly work on getting an answer to that question. But to echo what Lizzie said, I am curious if any of you all have ideas about how you might encourage or require providers to stay type 3.
All right, so just because we are running short on time, I'm going to keep this moving, but I so appreciate everybody who is asking questions, and there's a lot of activity in the chat box today. Lastly, the last section of this application is just going to ask you to briefly describe how you've engaged your program partners and how you've solicited some of their feedback. That might be through the survey that some of you have mentioned you might do. That might be any sorts of ways. So in order to keep moving the PowerPoint forward to make sure we finish on time, I'm going to move on, but I am curious to hear if you have any plans on engaging your program partners in a unique way. Please type it in the chat box and share with the group.
Lizzie, can I jump in before you move on?
Of course.
Just one question from Pam Miller. She asked if childcare providers received the round 1 of the LaCAP relief grant, are they eligible to apply in round 2? Yes, you should encourage them to apply in round 2, and the department will be determining eligibility. So if there's any confusion around it, I would just go ahead and encourage them to apply. And the deadline for that provider level grant is tomorrow. So if you have any folks who have questions, please reach out to them and encourage them to apply, and reiterate that the deadline is tomorrow. And that tight timeline is really just because we want to get the funding out the door as quickly as possible. So we know it's a very tight turnaround, but we want to make sure that we can respond in a timely manner.
Great, thanks, Taylor. Okay.
And Lizzie, I don't think Sydney is on, but I can go ahead and walk us through these slides, if that would be helpful.
Great, that would be great.
Okay, so, and this will address a couple of the questions in the chat box, actually. We know that it will be helpful as you think about this community level grant application and supporting childcare providers in your community to access some data. Some of you, especially those of you who are also CCR&Rs and that have been working on respite care over the course of the last couple months, have already been receiving some data updates from the department. Because all of the lead agencies will be considering this, we're going to provide some data specific to COVID-19 recovery, which will include parish-wide information or network-wide information, as well as center-level data, so that you can start to better understand, which centers are closed, which centers have converted to type 3, which family childcare providers maybe have come online that weren't previously open, things like that, as well as some data that you've already seen. We're going to include in it some of your cleaned up child count data and some licensed capacity data, just so that you can start to really wrap your head around, the landscape of childcare in the aftermath of COVID-19. I would encourage you to use this data, but also to do things that have been suggested by folks already in the chat box, like Cindy Rushing in Rapides, who's administering a survey. This data may be a starting point, but doing something like that to really understand the needs of childcare providers in your community will also be tremendously helpful. So some of the data that will be included, as I mentioned, will be childcare provider data, as well as parish demographics or network demographics. And then there'll also be some information on COVID-specific data. For example, the number of children that were served or are served by respite care, or the number of children who have been approved for emergency CCAP. That may be helpful to you as well. And yes, so we'll be sending, I believe what we're going to do is we're going to drop this data into your FTP. We hope to do that in the next day or so, and we'll send out an email when that has been dropped into your FTP, letting you know which folder it's in, etc. And as you dig into each of the tabs, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll provide some information on who to get in contact with in the email. But we hope this data is helpful to you as you think about applying for this community grant. Okay, Lizzie, are you there?
I am.
All right, so y'all, I know we only have like 3 minutes left and we covered a lot of ground today and you probably have a lot of questions. If there's anything we can answer in the next couple of minutes, we're happy to do so, but we're also willing and able to get on the phone with any of you individually or answer questions by email as they come up. Anything you would add, Lizzie?
No, I don't think so. I think I am currently scanning the chat box to figure out which questions we have not yet answered. So I am hopefully maybe we can get to those in the next couple of minutes, but feel free, of course, as always, to email us your questions and we'll hopefully get you answers as soon as possible.
Yeah, I really feel like we did a good job today of answering the chat box as we were moving along. Taylor was answering as we were moving along, so was Lizzie. It was a good team effort. So if you have any other questions, oh, we got one more from Michelle Allen. What do we do about our LA4 parent referrals?
Hey, Michelle, I will send, this is Lindsay. I will send out the template for everyone to complete like I did for the first semester.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, I think we are done for the day. I do appreciate everyone being helpful and sharing, and Stacy and Cindy sharing that about their survey, and everyone, all the other lead agencies sharing all your information and all your best practices. It's really very wonderful that you guys share all the time. So thank you and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.